Howdy, and welcome to week 3, video 2. Another concept you will hear quite a bit in any type of risk: cybersecurity risk, reputation risk, strategic risk. It doesn't matter, not necessarily tied to enterprise risk, but a basic risk construct is something we call the risk register. And risk registers are very easy to come up with on Excel spreadsheets. I have sat down with small business owners who are completely overwhelmed when people start talking about risk, pull out an Excel spreadsheet and say, let's just write down the things that you fear could go wrong and start there. Weather, theft, market, whatever. And it's a very easy way to capture that. So before we use any analytics tool, talk about data analytics or anything, we got to go through this data collection process. And excuse me, and that includes identifying risk. So it's very inefficient to go through this every time. So we try to recapture as much of this data as possible for several reasons. First of all, it gives us traceability. It's very important to give us traceability. So when we make a decision, we can go back and see what factors, right or wrong, were used and adjust accordingly. Second of all, it kind of gives us templates. When we go through this later, we don't want to have to start from scratch. We remember what we had before, and oh yeah, maybe we've learned some things to add to it. So it's just like any kind of system development where you want to build on what you have. So a risk register, it's a tool. It's a tool for documenting risk. It is not going to help you calculate your decisions. It's not going to help you figure out what path you should do. It basically documents the risk and the actions needed to manage each risk, period, end of discussion. And it's just a simple table. You could Excel spreadsheet, you can do it a little more sophisticated in a database. It doesn't matter. Let's look at the simple one. Here's an example. You've got a risk, warehouse could explode, you could lose a shipment, you could do a power outage, you could have an employee shortage, and the like. You have a probability assigned to each of these. Maybe it's a very small probability that the warehouse is going to explode. That says greater than 1%. I think it's supposed to say less than 1%. But you could have an impact. It's a black swan event. Less than 1%, but oh my gosh, if the warehouse explodes, we're out of business. By the way, in cybersecurity or any other kind of incident response, people often confuse two concepts: disaster recovery and business continuity. Disaster recovery would be when your warehouse explodes and you don't have a backup. Business continuity would be a fire that destroys perhaps part of your warehouse, but you can stay in operation. Your mitigation, I don't know what your action going to be. Your residual risk is high. Your residual risk is what happens after an event occurs. Even if it had a small risk, what's your residual risk? And what's your probability you're willing to accept, and what's the accepted impact? So there's some that we can't do on a daily basis. We can't accept a lost shipment, power outage, what's the residual risk? Others we might say, remember our way of dealing with risk: accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer. Well, our accepted risk could be high. We're going to accept that risk even though a warehouse could explode because, well, there's not much we can do other than put in safety and have insurance. That's transferring the risk. So their common elements are just identify the risk. If you're, again, I keep going back to cybersecurity, you'll find there all the National Vulnerability Database list all these vulnerabilities and everything, and they identify them by number. Then they give them a description. What could trigger that risk? What's the probability? And again, remember, this is a probability. It's going to be where we're kind of mushy on this. We're not sure what the probability of certain events could be, so we might create a probability on a distribution, or we might assign it, as I talked about in the last lecture, and just say, look, we're going to give it this probability. The impact, if you get one thing out of this class, never consider risk without considering the impact. People tend to say, oh, this could happen, this could happen. Okay, stop. What would the impact be? Because if you don't have visibility into what the impact is, it's very hard to determine some plan of action for either accepting, avoiding, transferring, or mitigating that risk. And you see these others, the residual risk, the accepted probability. What are you willing to accept? If you look at how people or how companies give credit, there's a certain probability of bad debt that they're willing to accept. If it's too low, then their credit policies are probably too restrictive, and they're probably not being able to do as much business as they could. So an accepted probability, and I don't know what that would be, so let's just say it's 2% of accounts being bad. Well, we would, honest people would like to say that should be 0%, but there's an accepted probability of yes, there's so many accounts because we're going to take the risk because we want to get credit out there because it's going to be customers buying our products. And then the accepted impact. So how do you do a risk register? Few steps. You identify the risk, you describe the risk, you assign an impact to that risk, and you record the responses to the risk or mitigating actions taken. That's it. Identify, describe, assign, and record. So when you describe a risk, just you can, in Excel, if you really know how to use Excel or Word or something, you can hyperlink it. But a description, when you say warehouse explosion, pretty much captures it, right? You don't need a 5-page document and all. And when you think about risk, when we're talking about this, you need to think about the threat or opportunities, the events, the impacts. All of this has to be mushing through your head. I went to law school, as you know, late in life. I've been licensed about 10 years, and I did learn once you go to law school, it changes your head. You begin to see risk everywhere. You don't look at a normal playground without thinking of all the bad things that could happen, right? You don't look at car accidents without thinking of all the consequences, because lawyers are deal with risk every day, and then it turns out they're very risk averse themselves because of that, because it heightens their awareness of the risk, threat, and the impact, and so it makes them more susceptible to seeing a common event and thinking of all the bad things that could happen. So the impact's just that, and usually we just give it a simple number from 1 to 5. We can come up with a qualitative high, medium, low. It's just described quantitatively or qualitatively. And then the risk is just what I said before. Accept, these are different terms here: accept, reduce, share, or transfer. Accept, mitigate, avoid, or transfer. And I've taken this, sources are listed here. Thank you for sticking with me. We're on to video 3.